Hi, everybody. My name is Jeannie Kwong. I'm a reporter for Delaware Online and the News Journal, and we're joined here today by my colleagues, Emily Lytle and Isabel Hughes. Emily and Isabel published a two-part report this week about Dover's record year for violent crime, and we wanted to have them here with us to talk about their reporting. Welcome, Emily and Isabel.
Thanks.
Thanks.
So I guess I wanted to start off talking about just how you guys started looking into this issue and tell us a little about how you came to discover this feeling that Dover is a forgotten city, as some called it.
Yeah, I'll start. I think all of last year, so Isabel and I both received police briefs, so we're kind of on top of what is happening in Dover, and Isabel especially throughout the state. But I think throughout the year, there was this feeling that we have noticed that there had been a lot of shootings, and we were picking up on that. And then especially in September, there was a large party at a park in Dover called Shooty Park with a bunch of college students, hundreds of students. And unfortunately, a young man died in a shooting there. And so it was really after that that we were kind of really struck by the problem in Dover of especially young lives being lost to gun violence. And we really wanted to look at the issue deeper and what was causing the violence, what were the root problems, and then what could possibly be done to make the situation better.
And to kind of add on to that too, really this summer we've seen across the state this, a real uptick in shootings. Like I said, across the state, in Wilmington, we saw this. And then when we saw, when we started really looking at Dover, we saw, this pattern is the same in Dover. And I'll be the first to admit, the News Journal has probably not paid enough attention to Dover in recent years. We had a Kent County reporter and then, he left a couple years ago. And since then, we haven't given a ton of focus on Dover. So we really felt like we're seeing this spike, this uptick. The city has kind of been forgotten. It's everybody. There's a quote in there from Dr. Sandra Gibney. She's a ER doc, and she's also part of Delaware's behavioral health consortium. And she says, Dover, the forgotten city. Everybody wants to talk about Wilmington's guns and drugs, but Dover is heartbreaking, and it's true. I mean, and even at the newspaper, we're guilty of not paying enough attention to Dover as we should. So that kind of all together is why we said, hey, we need to sit down and really look at this. It's clearly a problem. They not only had a record number of homicides, 9 killed, 8 by gunfire, but they had, it was a record number of shooting homicides as well. The last time this many people were killed in the city was 2015, and it was 7 people shot. And like I said, there were 8 people shot in 2020. So clearly, this is a problem that's been getting worse. And it's just going to keep getting worse if something doesn't happen.
So tell me a little bit about the voices that you heard from on the ground. What's the overall attitude you feel of Dover residents right now, as well as the government officials that you approached about this problem?
I think the initial reaction when we told people that we were working on this story was kind of like nodding and saying, yeah, we are familiar with this. Yeah, this is a problem, and kind of just exhaustion about it, because people know it's happening, and they know that specifically this one area in downtown Dover, and it's not throughout the city-wide problem, which is what we touch on in the stories, is that it's pretty isolated in specific pockets of the city. So it can be easy to kind of just walk past and not look at it. But the people who live here and who have lived here for a long time, and the city officials, they know that it's a problem, and it's visible through trash on the street. It's visible through loitering and crowds of people. It's something that people notice, and it has been going on for decades, whether it's on New and Reed Street or whether it's on a different street because the problem has existed for a while. So I think people were tired and I think especially with the shootings of the young people and just shootings in general, it's another one kind of idea too.
And they're frustrated. The residents are really frustrated, especially in the Black community, because that's where the majority of the shootings are happening. It's the majority of young Black men who are being shot. 7 of the 8 people killed in Dover this year were Black. So they've long felt, and I'm talking about like decades and decades, that the city has really ignored them. The city has not been inclusive, and they have a right to feel that way. We know from history that Black community members and officials and especially police have had pretty adversarial relationships. But it's really kind of come to a head where they're just like really fed up with sometimes the excuses that city officials make. We had one Dover city councilman who's actually a former police officer with Dover police say to us, name a city where the violence, meaning name a city where that doesn't happen, where there are more than 35,000 people. It's not really a valid argument. The city I come from, I was born and raised in Massachusetts. It's around the same size as Dover. It's about 42,000 people. And in 2020, they had 1 person shot and that person died. So they had 1 shooting, 1 homicide in all of 2020. And like I said, it's a city of 42,000 people. So
it doesn't have to be normal.
Yeah, and that's the thing that I think residents are really frustrated with. It's like they know city officials know of these issues. And when we interviewed the mayor, he never tried to deny that this is a problem. One of the things he said to us that didn't end up in the story, but that kind of stood out. And I said something like, this is a record year for you all. And he said, yeah, it's a record we're not proud of. So they know of the issues, but they either try to justify it, saying, well, any city of 35,000 plus is going to have these issues. I don't really buy that argument. Or you get other people who say, I think we got feedback from one person who was like, didn't dispute any of the story, didn't dispute the facts in the story, but said, well, you writing the story is making my job really difficult, to bring businesses here. And it's like, well, wouldn't you want to be part of the solution to the problem? We all know that ignoring a problem and pretending it doesn't exist never makes it better. So, yeah, I can understand maybe this story makes your job a little bit more difficult to bring businesses downtown, but I mean, don't you want it to be fixed? Don't you want to stop seeing people dead? Don't you want the area to be better? It's just, people know these issues, but they justified their way.
Sure. Yeah, I'm certainly familiar with that attitude. One thing that I wanted to touch on that I thought was really interesting about your series, because you did mention that we think of violence in Delaware as being concentrated in Wilmington. But I thought your report kind of did an interesting look comparing what happens in Dover versus what happens in Wilmington and what drives that. Can you touch on that difference a little bit, and what does that really tell us about how we can solve this problem and how we can move forward from it?
Yeah, so one of the things, and I got this a lot from talking with a handful of DEA officials, special agents, is that the violence in Dover is different from Wilmington in that it's really it's really drug centered in Dover. And I'm sorry, and it's coming from gangs who are peddling those drugs. The police chief said to us, it was a great quote, gangs, their business is drugs, and firearms is the way to protect their business. In contrast, in Wilmington, prosecutors have long said it's more gangs of friends rather than your traditional Bloods and Crips type gangs. So one of the things in Dover, kind of knowing that it's really the gangs that are driving a lot of this violence, and they're fighting over, because their business is drug sales, they're fighting over turf, they're fighting over the best product, and then you have the retaliations and whatnot. Knowing that it's the DEA is really looking to go in and not just take down these people, but then they have to get into the community and target the kids who are most at risk of gang recruitment. And, these are lower income, kids who are growing up seeing this violence, who have trauma in their lives because of, what they're seeing, what they're experiencing. These are kids who, their water might go out or their lights might go out. So the DEA is kind of trying to now do a two-part thing. Is they need these investigations where they go in, they take down these gangs and these drug trafficking organizations. But then they also know if they just do that and leave and don't, put people in the education system, don't have youth programs and whatnot, then in 2 or 3 years, it's just going to be filled by another gang. So that's kind of the difference between Dover and Wilmington.
Mm-hmm. And Emily, how do you think that makes it either easier or harder to solve it? Or, what are some things that you found out that could be promising ways forward?
Sure. So I've been covering Dover for about 1.5 years. And I think that idea that Isabel talked about with focusing on youth and intervening early and providing young kids with mentors and support systems has been around, especially as I talked to the new police chief, Tom Johnson. He came in February of this year, or last year, sorry, 2021 now. And he is very much motivated by the idea of getting to these kids early before they are recruited by gangs. So I think that is a big conversation around Dover. But as far as what makes Dover interesting and the comparison with Wilmington, I think another aspect that can be a barrier as well is that there's a lot of things in Dover that people cling to that they're proud of. The composition, Dover's a unique city. It's super small. It has this kind of small town vibe, but it's also the capital of the state. And so you have Legislative Hall, you have the Dover Air Force Base, which is a huge employer. And then you have the NASCAR, you have the Speedway down the street. You have a lot of things that people are proud of and that they want to point your attention to, especially with drawing in tourists, with drawing in building up the economy. The downtown area has been building up, and they've been really focusing on drawing businesses here, like Isabel mentioned too. So I think it's easy to kind of focus on those things and forget about the small pockets where it's just so distinctly different, where there is just so much blight and so much just visible distress, and it's just problematic. So I think it's easy. That's when we're talking about the forgotten city aspect of it. It's easier for people to turn the other way. And so I think just the character of Dover is unique in that way. And especially when people are having conversations about kind of the reputation of Dover and what they think of it, which has evolved over the years as well too, I think.
That is really interesting, and I never thought of it that way. Thank you, Emily and Isabel, for joining us this morning. You all can read their 2-part report on Dover's record year for violence on the News Journal and Delaware Online. We'll put a link in the comments. Thank you again so much. You guys should follow us and subscribe to the paper. Emily and Isabel have both put a lot of work into focusing on, these undertold stories and parts of the state that we sometimes have not always paid attention to. And I think that we're going to have a really good year for some of those deeper, in-depth human stories. So thanks everybody for joining us.
Thanks, Jeannie.
Thanks.